The flash of cameras went off in bursts, illuminating the gallery in erratic white light. The hum of the crowd echoed through the open space, punctuated by gasps of awe and admiration. I stood near the back, just out of view, watching the guests file in. I could see the excitement on their faces as they took in the images. But for me, this night wasn't about artistic success. It was about something far deeper, far darker. The moment I'd been waiting for came when the doors opened wide. And Kate walked in, arm in arm with him, Ethan. I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat but quickly swallowed it down. From a distance, they looked like a perfect pair, laughing and whispering, unaware of what was about to unfold. Ethan, the sculptor, the man who had quietly crept into my life, into my wife's heart, and slowly chipped away at everything we had built together. I never planned to seek revenge. It wasn't in my nature, or at least, it hadn't been. But after finding the texts, the late-night calls, and the undeniable distance that had grown between us, I realized that confronting them outright would do nothing. Kate would deny it, and Ethan, well, he wasn't the type to care about the consequences of his actions. So, I decided to let my work speak for me. As a photographer, I had a knack for capturing moments, intimate, fleeting slices of life that often went unnoticed by the untrained eye. But now, those same skills have taken on a new purpose. Each image hanging in the gallery tonight was a piece of our life together. Smiling faces, joyous occasions, quiet moments of love. To anyone else, they would look like the epitome of a happy couple. But I had buried the truth within each frame, concealed just beneath the surface. If you looked closely enough, you would see it. I watched as Kate moved from photo to photo, her gaze lingering a little longer on each one. A small smile tugged at her lips at first, as though she was reminiscing about the times we had shared. But then, something shifted. Her expression changed. Confusion. Her brow furrowed as she leaned in to inspect one of the photos, a shot from our trip to the coast last summer. In the reflection of a glass window behind us, barely noticeable, stood a figure. It was Ethan, his face half hidden but unmistakable to anyone who knew him. She quickly moved to the next photo, then the next, her steps growing more frantic with each passing second. I could see the panic start to rise in her eyes as she realized this wasn't just an ordinary exhibition. This was a message, my message. The room was starting to grow quieter, the murmur of voices dying down as people followed Kate's path through the gallery. They, too, began to notice the inconsistencies, the hidden figure in the background of our lives. Some whispered to each other, others just stared, unsure of what they were witnessing. I stepped forward, into the light now, and our eyes met. Kate froze, her mouth slightly open as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. For a split second, I felt a pang of something, regret, maybe? Pain? I wasn't sure, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold satisfaction of seeing her realize the full weight of her betrayal. She took a few steps toward me, her hand outstretched as though she could somehow reach across the chasm that had opened between us. "Mark," she began, her voice barely a whisper. What is this?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The answer was hanging on every wall around us. Kate stood there, her hand still hanging in the air, her eyes pleading for an explanation that I wasn't going to give. The words were caught in her throat like she hadn't yet fully processed what was happening. But I could see it in her face, the realization was settling in. Each photo, every carefully captured moment, wasn't what she thought. They were never what she thought. I glanced over her shoulder at the crowd behind her. People were whispering, glancing back and forth between the images and Kate. Some of them had puzzled expressions, while others seemed to be piecing it all together. They knew. At least, they suspected. "What's going on, Mark?" she asked again, louder this time, her voice shaking with confusion and a hint of fear. I let the silence between us grow heavy. I wanted her to feel the weight of it, the same way I'd felt it in the weeks leading up to this moment. The late nights, the endless calls she thought I didn't know about, the way she'd started looking through me instead of at me. I saw it all. I was a photographer, after all. Observing was what I did best. "We had a good run, didn't we?" I finally said, my voice calm and steady. I could feel the crowd shifting, their attention locked on us now. Kate blinked, confused by my sudden nonchalance. "What are you talking about? What is this?" Her voice cracked. She gestured wildly at the walls, at the photos of our life together that now felt like a museum of lies. I walked past her, stepping closer to the largest photo in the gallery. It was our wedding day, Kate in her white dress, looking radiant under the soft glow of the setting sun. My arm around her waist, both of us smiling like we had the world at our feet. The perfect picture. But if you looked closely, just beneath the delicate lace of her veil, was something no one could ignore, a shadow. A faint silhouette of a man standing in the background. Ethan. His figure blended into the soft hues of the sky, but there he was, lurking like he always had been. You don't see it, do you? I asked, my voice low enough so only she could hear. You thought I didn't notice. You thought I wasn't paying attention. But I see everything, Kate. Her breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, I saw her composure start to crack. She stepped closer to the photo, squinting at it, her fingers shaking as they hovered near the glass. No, she whispered, her voice trembling as she finally saw it. You did this? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She spun around, her face pale, the panic clear in her eyes now. The rest of the gallery had fallen into a hushed silence, the guests no longer feigning interest in the artwork but watching this quiet collapse unfold in real time. Ethan, the man who had been standing confidently by her side moments ago, was now conspicuously absent. He must have slipped out the back when the first whispers started. Coward. I thought you'd like it, I said, my voice dripping with bitterness I could no longer hide. You always wanted to be part of my art. Well, now you are. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. I'd seen enough fake emotions to recognize when someone was performing, and I wasn't about to be her audience anymore. This wasn't about us, not really. It was about the image we projected to the world. The perfect couple. The happy, successful photographer and his loving, devoted wife. But that image was shattered now, broken into pieces just like every photo on these walls. Kate wiped at her eyes, but she didn't say a word. What could she say? There was no apology that would erase what she had done. No words that could undo the fact that she had chosen him over me. Over us. The weight of my decision finally hit me. This wasn't just about her and Ethan. It was about the betrayal of everything we'd built. The life I thought we were living, the love I thought was real. It was all a carefully constructed lie, and I had spent months editing, filtering, and framing it, just like I did with my photographs. But the truth was far uglier than any of these images could ever show. I took a step back, letting the full scope of the gallery wash over me. The photos, the memories, the betrayal. It was all here, laid bare for everyone to see. Kate turned slowly, as if searching for some escape, some way to fix this. But there was no fixing it. There was no going back. Mark, she started, but her voice trailed off as she realized the truth. There was nothing left to say. I looked at her one last time, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe a part of me still wanted her to say something that would make it all better. To offer some explanation that would make this nightmare go away. But deep down, I knew it was over. It had been over for a long time. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Kate standing there in the middle of the gallery. Behind me, I could hear the soft murmur of the crowd starting to rise again, the sound of people whispering, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The door closed softly behind me, and for the first time in months, I felt the cool night air hit my face. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, before walking away, leaving the gallery, the photos, and everything I thought we had behind. The walk home was longer than usual, though I couldn't say if it was because of the actual distance or the weight of everything I just unleashed. My legs moved on autopilot while my mind raced, trying to keep pace with the events of the night. The exhibition had gone exactly as I'd planned, but the aftermath, well, that was something I hadn't fully prepared for. As I reached the front steps of our house, I paused, staring at the door. How many times had I walked through it, believing in the illusion that everything was fine? The door itself seemed to mock me now, standing between the life I thought I had and the harsh truth that had unraveled in those gallery walls. I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I sat on the porch, leaning back against the railing. The cool night air was still, the neighborhood quiet, as if the world hadn't just shifted for me. I let my head fall back and closed my eyes, trying to find some kind of clarity in the mess I'd created. Had it been worth it? Exposing Kate like that, turning our private lives into an open wound for the world to see? I heard footsteps approaching, and I didn't need to open my eyes to know who it was. Kate's presence was something I had grown so familiar with over the years that even in the silent tension between us, I could feel her. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, her breath unsteady as though she'd been running. "Mark," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. I opened my eyes but didn't look at her. Instead, I stared out at the empty street, listening to the quiet hum of the city in the distance. Part of me didn't want to hear whatever she had to say. Another part, though, needed to know what came next. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice cracking at the last word. I didn't answer right away. My hands gripped the edges of the porch railing, my knuckles turning white. "Could we talk? Could we possibly make sense of any of this?" Finally, I spoke, my voice hollow. "Talk about what, Kate?" She hesitated before taking a few steps closer, sitting on the step below me, her eyes searching my face for some sign of softness. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to meet her eyes. I couldn't bear to see the guilt, or worse, the regret. "I know I've hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted it to get to this point." I let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't want it to get to this point? How do you think it was going to end, Kate? With you and Ethan riding off into the sunset while I smiled and took your picture?" She flinched at the mention of his name. Good. She needed to feel it. "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "It was never about him." She stopped, struggling to find the right words as if anything she said could somehow make things better. "I was lost, Mark. I felt like we were drifting apart. And he made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time." "Spare me," I muttered, finally turning to look at her. The sight of her, sitting there on the steps with tears in her eyes, might have broken me once. But now? It just felt hollow. "Don't act like you're the victim here." "I'm not," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not trying to excuse what I did. But you need to understand, we weren't okay, Mark. We haven't been for a long time." I stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of the woman I'd married, the woman I thought I knew. But all I saw now was a stranger. A stranger who had torn apart the life we had built together and left the pieces scattered in her wake. "I know we weren't perfect," I finally said, my voice low. "But you didn't even give me a chance. You just replaced me." The silence between us grew heavy again, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it. But instead, she bowed her head, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. "I never wanted to replace you," she whispered. "I just wanted to feel like I mattered." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt something other than anger. It was faint, but it was there. This ache, this dull understanding that maybe, in some twisted way, we had both failed each other. But that didn't excuse her actions. It didn't erase the betrayal. "You mattered," I said quietly, leaning forward, my elbows resting on my knees. "You mattered to me, Kate. You always did." She looked up at me then, her eyes wide with shock, as if she hadn't expected me to say that. But it was the truth. For all the lies and the deceit, that part had always been true. I had loved her, and maybe I still did, somewhere beneath the pain. But love didn't erase what she had done. It didn't change the fact that our marriage had become nothing more than a photograph of a life that no longer existed. Kate reached for my hand, her fingers brushing against mine. For a moment, I didn't pull away. I let her hold on, as if by doing so she could tether us back to the life we used to have. But it was too late. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Mark." I stood up, pulling my hand from hers, the cold air rushing between us. "I know," I said softly. "But sometimes, sorry isn't enough." With that, I turned and walked into the house, leaving her on the steps outside. As I closed the door behind me, the sound of it echoing through the empty hallway, I realized that what we had was over. Not because of Ethan, or the affair, or the lies. But because we had both stopped fighting for each other long before any of that. And no photograph, no matter how perfectly composed, could capture what had already been lost. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the images of Kate and Ethan flashed behind my eyelids, haunting me like a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was reality, and no matter how much I wanted to forget, I knew there was no going back. The next morning, I sat in my studio, surrounded by photos. The air was thick with the scent of chemicals, the remnants of a night spent developing images. My camera sat on the table, the lens pointed straight at me, a silent observer of the chaos in my mind. It had always been my tool, my way of making sense of the world. But now, the very thing I had used to expose Kate's lies was also a reminder of what I'd lost. I picked up a stack of freshly printed photos and flipped through them. The gallery's collection of happy moments that had now been tainted by the truth. The hidden shadows of Ethan lurking in the background of each picture. I thought the exhibition would give me some sort of closure, that by exposing Kate's betrayal in such a public way, I would finally be able to move on. But I didn't feel free. I just felt empty. The door to the studio creaked open, and I glanced up to see my assistant, Jamie, standing in the doorway, her face a mixture of concern and uncertainty. She'd been with me for years, helping with shoots and organizing my chaos. She'd always known when to step in and when to step back. "You okay, Mark?" she asked softly, stepping inside. I saw the papers. The exhibition, it was something else. Something else, I echoed, a hollow laugh escaping my lips. "Yeah, you could say that." She hesitated, then moved closer, her eyes scanning the scattered photos on the table. "You really did it, didn't you? You exposed everything." I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Yeah, I did." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence in the room was heavy, and I could feel her trying to find the right words, something to make sense of the wreckage. "Did it help?" she finally asked. I swallowed hard, staring down at one of the photos in my hand. It was of Kate and me, sitting on the beach, the sun setting behind us. But there it was again, the shadow of Ethan, barely visible on the horizon, like a ghost haunting the edges of our happiness. "No," I said quietly. "It didn't help." Jamie sighed, taking a seat across from me. "You know, I always thought you two were solid. From the outside, it seemed like you had it all figured out." "Yeah, well, appearances can be deceiving," I muttered, tossing the photo back onto the table. "Turns out, we were both just pretending." She didn't say anything for a while, just watched me, her expression softening as the silence stretched between us. "You're not a bad person, Mark," she finally said. You're hurting. And maybe what you did wasn't the best way to deal with it, but it doesn't make you a monster." I scoffed, leaning back in my chair. I made her pain public. I put our private life on display for the world to see. "What kind of person does that?" "A person who's been betrayed," Jamie said simply. "A person who's been hurt. We all do things we regret when we're in pain." I stared at her for a long moment, her words sinking in. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't about right or wrong. It was about how people break, how they lash out when they've been wounded. I had made a spectacle of Kate's betrayal, but in the end, the person I had hurt the most was myself. Jamie stood up, giving me a small, sad smile. "You'll figure it out, Mark. You always do." As she left the studio, I let her words linger. Figure it out. But what was there to figure out? I had already burned down the bridge between Kate and me. The only thing left to do now was sift through the ashes and try to rebuild something from the ruins. 2 days later, Kate showed up at the studio again. This time, there was no hesitation. She walked right in, her face pale but determined, her eyes focused on me with a kind of clarity I hadn't seen before. "Mark," she said, her voice steady. "We need to talk." I didn't look up from the photo I was editing, my fingers moving mechanically across the screen as I adjusted the brightness and the contrast. It was just another photo, another moment I had captured and manipulated, just like the rest of my life. "I don't have anything else to say, Kate," I muttered. She crossed the room, standing in front of the desk, forcing me to look at her. "Well, I do." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Fine, say what you need to say." Kate hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I went to see Ethan." I tensed, my jaw tightening at the mention of his name. "Oh? And what did your lover have to say?" She winced, but she didn't back down. "He's leaving. He's moving to LA for a new project. And he told me he doesn't want me to come with him." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "What?" Kate shook her head, her voice cracking. "He said it's over, Mark. That he never wanted anything serious. She stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "He just used me." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always imagined this ending one way, with Kate choosing Ethan over me, running off into the sunset with her perfect artist. But this was something I hadn't expected. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I watched her, standing there, broken and lost, and part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction. This was what she deserved, right? To feel the same betrayal she had inflicted on me. But another part of me, a deeper part, couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. She had been played, just like I had. "Kate," I started, but she cut me off. I know I don't deserve your pity, she said quickly, wiping at her eyes. And I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But I need you to understand something. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. I loved you, Mark. I still do, she whispered, her voice trembling. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I let everything else, the gallery, the people, the expectations, consume me. And I let Ethan use that to get to me. I thought he was offering me something I was missing, but he wasn't. He was just a distraction. A distraction, I repeated, bitterness creeping into my voice. So that's what our marriage was. A mistake you needed to escape from? No, she said fiercely, stepping closer, her eyes locking onto mine. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I lost sight of us. Of what we had. And I don't know if we can fix it, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I stared at her, my emotions swirling in a chaotic mess. Could we fix it? Was there even anything left to fix? Or were we just two broken people, desperately clinging to the idea of something that was already gone? Kate took a step back, her shoulders slumping as she waited for my response. But the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say. Maybe I never would. I don't know, Kate, I finally muttered, shaking my head. I don't know if sorry is enough. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she turned and walked out of the studio, leaving me alone with the shattered pieces of our lives. A week passed, and I avoided Kate as much as possible. Our house became a minefield of unspoken words, each room holding memories I wasn't ready to confront. She would come home late, sometimes tiptoeing around me like a ghost, as if not to disturb the fragile truce we were living under. The irony of it wasn't lost on me. Before the affair, it was me spending late nights in the studio, and now, the roles had reversed. One evening, I found myself in the gallery. It was after hours, and the place was quiet, with only the dim lighting casting long shadows across the walls. The photos from the exhibition were still up, a silent reminder of what I'd done. Each one is a snapshot of our life, twisted now with the knowledge of her betrayal. But I didn't come here to dwell on the past, I came to find answers. Somewhere in those images, there had to be something I'd missed. A clue, a sign of when it all started to unravel. I moved from picture to picture, analyzing every detail. The first one was on our wedding day. Kate and I were smiling, wrapped in each other's arms, the sun setting behind us. At first glance, it was perfect, too perfect. But if you looked closely, there was a shadow just behind Kate. Almost imperceptible. It was Ethan. I'd edited him in, a subtle reminder of the lies hidden beneath the surface. I walked to the next image, one of us at a dinner party. Kate was laughing, her hand on my shoulder. But in the reflection of the wine glass on the table, Ethan's face was there, smirking like a phantom. I'd made sure that the images weren't obvious to anyone who wasn't looking for them. It was my private way of exacting revenge, a puzzle only Kate would be able to solve. And she had solved it. The night of the exhibition, I'd watched her face as she walked from photo to photo, her smile fading with each realization. The moment she understood that I knew everything was etched in my mind, as vivid as any photograph I'd ever taken. But now, standing in the gallery, I began to wonder if I had gone too far. I had wanted her to feel the same pain I did, but what had it really accomplished? I had turned our life into a public spectacle, but it hadn't healed the wounds. If anything, it had only deepened them. I found myself in front of the last photo. It was a simple shot of us sitting on a park bench, holding hands. There was no hidden Ethan in this one, no shadow lurking in the background. It was the only picture I hadn't altered. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about it felt sacred, untouched by the lies that had infected everything else. As I stood there, staring at the image, I realized something that terrified me. I still loved her, even after everything. After the betrayal and the lies, a part of me still wanted to hold on to that moment, the one where we were just two people in love, sitting on a bench with nothing between us. But was that enough? Could love survive something like this? Or had I already destroyed any chance of reconciliation with my own need for revenge? The sound of footsteps interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see Kate standing in the doorway, her face pale and tired, like she hadn't slept in days. She glanced at the photos on the wall, then back at me, her expression unreadable. "You're here," she said softly, walking toward me. "I needed to see the photos again," I replied, my voice tight. I thought maybe they'd tell me something I missed. Kate stopped beside me, her eyes scanning the image of us on the bench. And did they? I shrugged, not sure how to answer. I don't know. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, side by side, staring at the picture that seemed to represent everything we had lost. Finally, Kate broke the silence. I can't stop thinking about that day, she said quietly. It was one of the last times I remember us being happy. I nodded, my throat tightening. Me too. She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. Do you think we can ever get back to that? Or is it too late? I wanted to say something, to tell her that it wasn't too late, that we could find a way to rebuild what we had. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if we could ever fix what had been broken. Or if we were just two people trying to hold onto a memory that no longer existed. I don't know, Kate, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I really don't know. The next few days were a blur of awkward interactions and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Kate and I continued to exist in the same space, but the distance between us felt like an ocean. We didn't talk much, and when we did, it was about superficial things, bills, groceries, the dog. Anything but the real issue hanging over us like a storm cloud. One evening, I found myself back in the studio, trying to focus on a new project. My client had requested some editorial shots for a magazine, and I had a deadline looming, but my mind wasn't cooperating. Every time I raised the camera to my eye, I saw Kate. Every frame felt like it was missing something, like my work had lost its spark along with my marriage. Frustrated, I put the camera down and ran a hand through my hair, pacing the room. I couldn't keep going like this, pretending that things would magically fix themselves. I had to make a decision. Either we found a way to move forward, or we accepted that it was over. Just as I was about to pack up for the night, there was a knock on the studio door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened it cautiously, only to find Ethan standing there, his expression grim. "Mark," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." I stared at him, my body tensing at the sight of the man who had come between Kate and me. He didn't look like the smug, self-assured artist I had imagined. If anything, he looked defeated. "What the hell are you doing here?" I snapped, stepping outside and closing the door behind me. The last thing I wanted was him in my space. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes meeting mine. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now, but I had to come. There's something you need to know." "I don't care what you have to say," I said, my voice cold. "You've done enough damage." "I know," he replied, his tone surprisingly earnest. "And I'm not here to make excuses. What I did was wrong, and I don't expect forgiveness. But you need to understand that it wasn't just about Kate. It was never about her." My blood ran cold at his words. "What are you talking about?" Ethan hesitated, then looked away, as if he was struggling to find the right words. "Kate was vulnerable. She was struggling with your relationship, and I took advantage of that. But it wasn't because I wanted her. I was." He stopped, his jaw tightening as he looked back at me. "I was jealous of you." I blinked, completely caught off guard. "What? You have everything I've always wanted," he continued, his voice bitter. "A career, a marriage, a life that I could never have. I thought if I could take something from you, I'd feel better about my own failures. But I was wrong. All I did was ruin something good." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him in disbelief. This man, this person who had torn my life apart, was standing in front of me, admitting that his actions weren't about love, but envy. "You're pathetic," I muttered, shaking my head. Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded, his face pale and drawn. "I know." He turned to leave, but before he did, he stopped and glanced back at me. "For what it's worth, Mark, I'm sorry." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing in the cold, grappling with a new layer of betrayal. Ethan's confession didn't change what had happened, but it added another dimension to the pain. It wasn't just about Kate anymore. It was about something deeper. Something uglier. And I wasn't sure if I could ever truly come to terms with it. These chapters explore the complexity of forgiveness and the layers of betrayal, as Mark grapples with both his lingering love for Kate and the unexpected confession from Ethan. Their world becomes more tangled as they confront the possibility of reconciliation, or final separation. I didn't sleep that night. Ethan's confession played on a loop in my mind, each word adding another layer of confusion and frustration. His apology didn't absolve him, but it complicated everything. I had always imagined him as the villain in my story, but now I wasn't sure if I could maintain that narrative. His envy, his bitterness. Those weren't the motivations of a man in love with my wife. They were the motivations of a man lost in his own insecurities. But what did that change? Kate had still betrayed me, regardless of Ethan's reasons. The question was whether we could find our way back from that. The next morning, I found Kate in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of everything we hadn't yet said to each other. I decided it was time. "Kate," I said, leaning against the counter, "we need to talk." She didn't look at me right away, but I could see her body tense. After a moment, she set her cup down and turned to face me, her eyes guarded. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been waiting for this." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan came to see me last night." Her eyes widened, shock flashing across her face. "He did?" "Yeah," I said, watching her carefully. "He told me everything. About why he did it. About how it wasn't really about you." Kate's face crumpled, and she took a step back as if the weight of my words had physically hit her. Mark, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to get this far. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice rising with a mix of anger and pain. "Why didn't you come to me if you were struggling? We could have worked through it. Kate, we could have fought for us." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head. "I didn't know how, Mark. I was lost, and Ethan, he was there. It was a mistake, the worst mistake I've ever made, and I regret it every day. But I didn't know how to fix things with you." "Fix things?" I scoffed, the bitterness in my voice surprising even me. "You didn't even try, Kate. You just let it all fall apart." She wiped her eyes, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right, I didn't try. I was too afraid that it was already too late." I stared at her, my emotions warring within me. A part of me wanted to lash out, to yell and scream and make her feel the same pain I had been carrying for months. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, wanted to reach out and hold her, to tell her that we could still fix this if we tried. "I don't know if we can come back from this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She looked down at the floor, her hands trembling. "I understand." For a long moment, the silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then, she lifted her head and met my gaze, her expression filled with a quiet determination I hadn't seen in her for a long time. "But I want to try," she said softly. "If you're willing to give me that chance, Mark, I want to try to make this right." I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure if I could. But as I stood there, looking at the woman I had built a life with, I realized that despite everything, despite the lies, the betrayal, and the hurt, I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I don't know how to do this, Kate," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But I'm willing to try. For us." She let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her face. "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a resolution. But it was a start. Days turned into weeks, and Kate and I found ourselves navigating a fragile truce. We didn't jump into anything too quickly. There were no grand gestures or sudden declarations of love. Instead, we took small steps, testing the waters of our broken relationship, trying to figure out if there was still something worth saving. We started talking more, not just about the mundane things that had filled our conversations before, grocery lists and work schedules, but about us. About what went wrong and how we both let it get to that point. Those conversations weren't easy. Sometimes, they ended with one of us storming out of the room in frustration, but other times, we found moments of clarity. Kate admitted she had felt isolated for a long time. My long hours in the studio, my obsessive focus on my career. It had made her feel like she wasn't important anymore. She had tried to tell me, in her own way, but I hadn't been listening. I'd been too caught up in my own world. That didn't excuse her affair, and I made sure she knew that. But it did help me understand why it happened. We were both responsible for the cracks in our marriage, even if I hadn't seen them at the time. One night, a few weeks after our confrontation in the kitchen, we found ourselves sitting on the couch together, watching a movie. It was a small, simple thing, but it felt like a milestone. We hadn't done something like that in months, maybe even years. It felt almost normal, but normal was a long way off. There were still moments when I looked at her and felt the sting of betrayal when the image of her with Ethan flashed in my mind like an unwanted intruder. Trust didn't come back easily. And I wasn't sure if it ever would. Then there was the matter of my photography. The exhibition was still up at the gallery, drawing attention from critics and visitors alike. Kate hadn't gone back since that first night, But she knew the images were still there, a public display of our private pain. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me was proud of the work. It was some of the best photography I'd ever done. But another part of me wondered if I'd gone too far and if using our personal tragedy as art was just another way of keeping the wounds open. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Kate surprised me by bringing it up. "I've been thinking," she said, pushing her food around her plate. "About the exhibition." I looked up, cautious. "What about it?" She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I think you should take it down." I frowned. "Why?" "Because it's keeping us stuck in the past," she said quietly. "Every time I think about those photos, I feel like we're still trapped in that moment, that night when everything came crashing down. And I don't want to live in that anymore, Mark. I want to move forward." Her words hit me hard. She was right, of course. The exhibition, as powerful as it was, had become a monument to our pain, a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But it was also a part of my work, my career. Taking it down felt like admitting defeat. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I admitted. Kate reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "I know, but maybe that's the point. Maybe neither of us will ever be completely ready. We just have to make the choice to move on." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment. The moment when we either committed to rebuilding what we had or let it all slip away for good. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take it down." It was a decision I hadn't expected to make, but it felt right. The exhibition had served its purpose. It had given me a way to process my pain, to express the anger and hurt I hadn't known how to deal with. But now, it was time to let go. And as I looked at Kate, sitting across from me, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. Together. A few days after we decided to take down the exhibition, I found myself back in the gallery. The air was thick with the quiet hum of people moving through the space, stopping to study the images that had once meant so much to me. Each photograph on the wall was a chapter of our life, distorted and broken by the betrayal that had consumed us. I stood at the back of the room, watching as strangers interpreted my pain, my anger, my revenge. Kate had been right. The exhibition had done its job. It had screamed my hurt for the world to see. But now, standing there, it felt like I was screaming into the void. There was no release anymore. The satisfaction I thought I'd find from exposing our lives through my art had faded. Instead, it was like I'd built a cage for myself, a space where I was stuck reliving the worst moments of my life over and over again. As I moved through the gallery, preparing to take the images down, I noticed a couple standing in front of the photograph that had once been my favorite. An image of Kate and me laughing at a cafe, sunlight pouring over us, our faces full of joy. Hidden in the background, barely noticeable unless you knew to look, was Ethan. I'd planted him there as a reminder of what had happened, of what had tainted that happiness. The couple was discussing the photo in hushed tones, clearly intrigued by the subtle inclusion of Ethan. They were trying to make sense of it, to decode the story behind the image. I stood frozen, listening to them dissect my life like it was just another piece of art. "I think it's about how even the happiest moments are never perfect," the woman said thoughtfully, her finger tracing the outline of Ethan's figure in the background. "Yeah," the man agreed. "Like, no matter how good things seem, there's always something lurking beneath the surface." I clenched my fists at my sides, resisting the urge to interrupt them. They didn't know. They couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to be me at that moment. But their words stung because, in a way, they were right. I had spent so long trying to capture the perfect image, the perfect life, but perfection was always an illusion. I left the gallery that afternoon with the photographs packed away, and my exhibition finally closed. The gallery owner didn't protest much, sensing I was ready to move on. As I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I realized that this wasn't just about ending the exhibition. It was about taking control of my own narrative again. I didn't want to be defined by that pain anymore. When I got home, Kate was waiting for me. She'd been cautious since we made the decision, giving me space to process everything. I could see the tension in her shoulders as I walked through the door, the unspoken question hanging between us. "Did you do it?" she asked softly. I nodded, dropping my bag on the floor. "It's over." Her face softened with relief, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with. The woman I had built a life with before everything had gone wrong. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened still pressing down on us, but there was a shift. A small one, but a shift nonetheless. "Thank you," Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that wasn't easy for you." I shrugged, not trusting myself to say much. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. That night, for the first time in months, we sat down together at the dinner table without the shadow of the exhibition looming over us. The silence between us wasn't suffocating like it had been before. It was peaceful, like we were finally ready to stop looking back and start figuring out what came next. With the exhibition behind us, Kate and I had the space to focus on rebuilding, not just our relationship, but our lives. We had been walking on eggshells for so long, afraid to say the wrong thing, afraid to admit that things were still broken between us. But now, with the gallery closed and the photographs packed away, it felt like we could finally breathe again. I threw myself back into my work, but not in the obsessive way I had before. I no longer felt the need to prove something, to create art that captured the pain I had lived through. Instead, I started to look for beauty in the everyday moments, in the small, quiet things that I had overlooked when I was so focused on the big picture. One afternoon, I was in my studio, sorting through old negatives, when Kate knocked on the door. She hadn't come into my workspace in a long time, not since the affair. I looked up, surprised to see her standing there. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice tentative. "Of course," I said, moving some of my equipment aside to make room for her. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. I was thinking, maybe we could go away for a while. Just the two of us. Get out of the city, away from everything. Maybe it would give us a chance to start fresh. I stared at her, unsure of what to say. The idea of leaving felt foreign, but at the same time, it was appealing. We had been stuck in the same routine for so long, surrounded by reminders of everything that had gone wrong. A change of scenery might be exactly what we needed. Where would we go? I asked, cautiously optimistic. "I don't know," Kate admitted, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere we can just be ourselves again." I nodded, the idea slowly taking root in my mind. That sounds nice. For the first time in months, we allowed ourselves to imagine a future that wasn't clouded by the past. It wasn't going to be easy. And we both knew that. Trust was something that had to be rebuilt, and it would take time. But we were both willing to try. A few weeks later, we packed our bags and left the city behind, heading toward the mountains. The air was cool and crisp, the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold as autumn settled in. It felt like the world was giving us permission to shed the weight of the last few months and start anew. Our cabin was small and simple, nestled in a quiet valley with a view of the mountains in the distance. It was the perfect place to disappear for a while, to forget about everything that had happened and focus on healing. The first few days were awkward, filled with moments of uncertainty as we tried to find our footing again. But slowly, we began to reconnect. We went for long walks through the woods, talked about everything and nothing, and cooked meals together like we used to. There were still moments of tension, of course. Trust didn't come back overnight, but there was also a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Kate turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, Mark. For everything. I know it's going to take time, but I want to make this work. I want to be with you." I looked at her, the firelight flickering in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a real chance. We had been through hell, but we had survived. And now, we had the opportunity to build something new, something stronger. "I want that too," I said quietly, taking her hand in mine. "I'm not ready to give up on us." It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it didn't need to be. We were both committed to trying, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the cool mountain air filled the cabin, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And this time, it would be different. This time, we would make it work. Together. It had been several weeks since we left the city behind and retreated into the quiet of the mountains. In that time, Kate and I had grown closer. The wounds of the past hadn't fully healed, but the rawness of the betrayal had faded into something more manageable. We didn't talk much about Ethan, about the affair, or the exhibition. In a way, it was like we had mutually agreed to put those things in a box and leave them back in the city. But I knew that box would never really be closed until we faced it head on. One evening, the air outside was cold enough for us to start a fire in the cabin. The flames crackled as we sat across from each other, the room dimly lit by the orange glow. Kate was reading a book, but I could tell by the way she kept glancing up that her mind was elsewhere. My own thoughts were circling around the unspoken tension that still hung between us. We hadn't fully dealt with what had happened. The exhibition had been my way of lashing out, of externalizing my pain, but now that it was over, there was still so much left unsaid. Kate, I started, my voice breaking the comfortable silence. She looked up from her book, her eyes questioning. Yeah, I think we need to talk. Her face tensed, but she nodded. Okay, I wasn't sure where to begin, so I just dove in. We've been doing better, a lot better. But I don't think we've really dealt with everything. Kate closed her book slowly, setting it down on the coffee table. Her expression softened, but there was a guardedness to her posture, like she was bracing herself for what was coming. I know, she said quietly. You're right. I shifted in my seat, running a hand through my hair. I need to understand, not just what happened, but why. Why him? Why did you feel the need to? I trailed off, unsure how to finish the question without sounding accusatory. Kate sighed, leaning back in her chair. She took a long moment to gather her thoughts before speaking. I don't think there's a simple answer, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't about you, Mark. It was never about you. I wasn't looking for someone else. I wasn't unhappy with us, or at least, I didn't think I was. But Ethan. He came into my life at a time when I was feeling lost. I was getting so caught up in the world of art, in these new circles I was running in, and I think I just got swept away. I listened in silence, my chest tightening as she spoke. It wasn't the first time I had heard a variation of this explanation, but it still stung. I wasn't looking for an affair, she continued, her eyes filled with regret. But Ethan made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about love or attraction, really. It was about feeling like I mattered in a different way. I'm not proud of it, Mark. I know I hurt you more than I can ever make up for, and I hate myself for it. Her voice broke, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. But this wasn't about her guilt. This was about understanding. So, what now? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. We've been trying to rebuild, but how do we move forward? How do I trust you again? The silence that followed was heavy. Kate wiped her eyes and looked at me with deep sadness. I don't know if there's a straight answer to that. I can't take back what I did. I can't erase the hurt. All I can do is prove to you, every day, that I'm committed to us. I know that's not enough right now, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I stared into the fire, the flames flickering in my peripheral vision. This conversation felt like a crossroads, a moment where we would either truly begin to heal or fall apart. I want to move forward, I said, my voice rough from emotion. I do, but it's going to take time. And it's going to take effort. From both of us. Kate nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. I know, and I'm willing to do that. I love you, Mark. I always have. Even when I was lost, I never stopped loving you. Hearing those words should have brought me comfort, but instead, they felt like a bittersweet reminder of how fragile love could be. Love hadn't stopped the affair from happening. Love hadn't protected us from the fallout. But maybe, just maybe, love could help us rebuild. I love you too, I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth after everything that had happened. But they were true. Despite the betrayal, despite the pain, I still loved her. For the first time in a long time, we sat in silence, not out of avoidance, but out of understanding. The weight of what had happened between us would always be there, but at that moment, we had taken the first step toward unpacking it. As the fire burned down to embers and the night deepened, we stayed there, close but not touching, both of us knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But we were still on that road together. And for now, that was enough. The days began to blur into one another after that conversation. Kate and I had crossed a line, finally addressing the elephant in the room, but things still felt fragile. We'd peeled back the layers of our relationship just enough to see the cracks beneath, and now we were balancing on the edge of something that could either heal us or destroy us. Kate spent more time in the cabin, cooking dinner with me, going on walks, and making an effort to show she was present. She stopped taking her phone with her everywhere, leaving it on the counter like an unspoken promise that there were no more secrets. I noticed these changes. They were small but significant, each one a reminder that she was trying. But as much as I wanted to believe in our progress, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Some days, I would wake up and feel the weight of everything all over again, the betrayal. The anger, the uncertainty. I'd look at her across the table, wondering how we got here, questioning if I could ever truly move on. One morning, I woke up early, the sun just barely peeking through the curtains. Kate was still asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I slipped out of bed quietly, pulling on a sweater before heading outside. The mountain air was crisp, biting against my skin as I stepped onto the porch. The view from our cabin was breathtaking. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first signs of snow. The trees were a riot of autumn colors, burnt oranges, deep reds, and golden yellows. For a moment, I let myself get lost in the beauty of it, in the stillness of the world around me. But then, as always, my thoughts drifted back to the mess we were still entangling. I thought about Ethan, about the months Kate had spent sneaking around with him, lying to my face while I was too blind to see it. The anger simmered beneath the surface, even though I didn't want it to. I sat down on the porch steps, running a hand through my hair. Was this what the rest of our life would be like? A constant back and forth between trying to forgive and being reminded of what had happened. The door creaked open behind me, and Kate stepped out, wrapped in a blanket. She sat down beside me without a word, her body close enough that I could feel her warmth through the cold morning air. For a few minutes, we sat in silence, watching the world wake up around us. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" Her question caught me off guard. I turned to look at her, but her gaze was fixed on the horizon. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew. Kate pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her expression pensive. "I mean, do you think we're just delaying the inevitable? Maybe we're trying to fix something that can't be fixed." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and full of uncertainty. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly tight. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think it's worth trying. Don't you?" She sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. "I do. But sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions, you know? Like we're pretending everything's fine when it's not." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. There were days when it did feel like that. Like we were both playing roles in a performance neither of us believed in. But then there were other days. Moments when it felt like we were actually making progress, like we were finding our way back to each other, one step at a time. "I think that's part of the process," I said quietly. "It's not going to be perfect. There are going to be days when it feels like we're barely holding it together. But there are also going to be days when it feels right, when it feels like we're healing. We just have to get through the hard parts to get to the good ones." Kate looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. "Do you really think we can get there?" "I want to believe we can," I replied, my voice steady despite the doubt swirling inside me. "I love you, Kate. That hasn't changed. And I'm willing to fight for this, for us. But I need to know that you are too." She didn't answer right away, and for a moment, I feared the worst, that maybe she wasn't as committed as I was, that maybe she was already halfway out the door. But then she reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. "I'm fighting too," she said softly. "I'm scared, Mark. I'm scared that we'll never fully get past this, that you'll never be able to trust me again. But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." I squeezed her hand, feeling a flicker of hope rise in my chest. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay, but it was a start. We were both scared, unsure of what the future held, but we were still here. Still fighting. And for now, that had to be enough. We sat there together, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The warmth slowly chasing away the morning chill. The mountain stood tall and unchanging in the distance, a reminder that life, like the landscape, was full of peaks and valleys. Some days would be harder than others, but we would keep moving forward, one step at a time. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. A few weeks after that quiet morning on the porch, things had begun to settle into a strange kind of normalcy. Kate and I fell into a routine: morning coffee on the porch, late-night conversations by the fire, trying to rebuild something that was still cracked underneath. The pain of the affair lingered, always there in the background, but we had managed to push it far enough away that it no longer defined our every interaction. But sometimes, the past has a way of creeping back in, no matter how hard you try to shut it out. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Kate was out picking up groceries, and I had decided to clean up the studio room in the cabin. We hadn't used it much since we arrived. It had become a kind of storage space for random boxes and supplies. I figured it might be time to clear it out and create something new in the space. Maybe we could turn it into a photography studio for me, or a place for Kate to paint. Something that represented us moving forward. As I started sorting through old boxes, my hands brushed against a small leather-bound notebook at the bottom of one of them. It wasn't mine. Curious, I opened it, flipping through the pages until I realized what it was. Kate's journal. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the worn pages. I knew I shouldn't read it. It was private, her thoughts, her words, and after everything that had happened, I didn't want to invade her space. But a part of me couldn't resist. What if there was something in there that could help me understand? What if there were answers I hadn't found yet? Before I could convince myself to stop, I started reading. The entries were scattered, some from months ago, others from more recent times. Most of them were reflections on her art, on her feelings of being disconnected from herself. But then, I hit an entry that made my stomach turn. It was dated about a week before everything had come crashing down. I saw Ethan today. I don't know why I keep letting this happen. It's like there's something pulling me to him, something I can't explain. I know I shouldn't, but it feels like he understands me in a way no one else does, not even Mark. I hate that I feel this way, but I can't stop. When I'm with Ethan, everything else disappears. I don't have to think about the guilt or the consequences. It's just us, in that moment, and for a little while, I feel free. But it's wrong. I know it's wrong, and I know it's going to destroy everything if I keep going down this path. I don't know how to stop. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing in my chest. It felt like a punch to the gut, reading those words, and seeing the thoughts she had kept hidden from me. I had always known about the affair, known that she had feelings for Ethan, but seeing it laid out in her own handwriting made it feel fresh, like the wound had been ripped open all over again. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room spun around me, and all the progress we had made felt like it was slipping through my fingers. How was I supposed to move forward when this was still haunting us? I stood up abruptly, pacing the room, trying to shake off the wave of anger and betrayal that washed over me. I thought we were getting past this. I thought we were healing. But now, all I could see was that entry, those words echoing in my mind. He understands me in a way no one else does. It felt like a knife to the heart. Was that how she really felt? Did she still feel that way? Was I just fooling myself, thinking we could ever go back to what we were? When Kate came back from the store later that afternoon, I was still in the studio, the journal sitting on the table in front of me. She walked in, her face bright with a smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the bags down on the counter. I didn't say anything at first. I just pointed to the journal, my hands trembling with barely controlled anger. "You need to explain this." Kate's eyes widened in shock when she saw the journal. "Mark, I interrupted, my voice low but sharp. I wasn't going to read it, but I found it, and I thought maybe it would help me understand. But now, all I see is that you felt more with him than you ever did with me." Her face paled, and she took a step toward me, her hands outstretched in a gesture of peace. "Mark, no, that's not what I meant. It was just, I was confused, okay? I wasn't thinking straight." I shook my head, stepping back from her. "Confused? You wrote that he made you feel free. Like I wasn't enough." Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head furiously. "That's not true. I was lost, Mark. I didn't know who I was or what I was doing. I was just trying to make sense of everything, and Ethan, he was a distraction. It wasn't real." "Did it feel real when you were with him?" I snapped, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Kate flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mark. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I don't feel that way anymore. I don't want Ethan. I want you." I stared at her, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was telling the truth, that she was committed to making things right. But that journal entry had planted a seed of doubt, one that was growing faster than I could control. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I thought I could, but reading that, it's too much. It hurts too much." Kate stepped closer, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away. "Please," she whispered, her voice desperate. "Don't give up on us. Not now." I looked at her, my heart aching. I didn't want to give up. I didn't want to lose her. But the pain was suffocating, and I wasn't sure if I could find my way out. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving Kate standing there in silence. As I stepped outside into the cold mountain air, I realized that the echoes of the past were louder than I had anticipated. And no matter how hard we tried to outrun them, they would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pull us back into the darkness. The gallery buzzed with life. Bright lights illuminated the walls, casting long shadows as people moved through the space, their voices blending into a low hum. This was the night I had been waiting for. My photographs, our photographs, were finally on display. And Kate was here, somewhere among the crowd, unaware of what awaited her. I stood near the entrance, watching as guests drifted from picture to picture. They admired the technical details, the compositions, and the emotions captured in each frame. But they couldn't see the truth hidden beneath the surface. Not yet. Only I knew what each image really meant. Kate entered the gallery late, her arrival subtle, as if she were hoping to blend in. I caught a glimpse of her from across the room, her expression unreadable as she scanned the walls, her eyes landing on the first photograph in the series. It was one of our favorite memories, an image of us hiking together in the mountains. She stood there for a moment, taking in the vibrant colors of the landscape, the way the sun kissed our faces. And the joy etched into every detail. But then, slowly, she began to notice the cracks. I had spent months working on this exhibition, perfecting every image, and carefully weaving in the distortions. From a distance, the photos looked like the snapshots of a perfect life. But up close, hidden within each one, were subtle details, little glimpses of the lies that had torn us apart. In the first photo, if you looked closely enough, you could see Ethan's shadow in the background, barely noticeable but undeniably present. A ghost lingering in the corners of our lives. Kate's expression changed as she moved to the next photo. It was a picture of us at a dinner party, laughing with friends. Except, in this version, her glass was cracked, the wine spilling over the edge like blood. She stared at it, confusion flickering across her face, her hand reaching out as if she could touch the image and fix it. I stayed where I was, letting her move through the gallery, watching as her realization grew with each step. Picture after picture told the same story, a life that seemed perfect from a distance, but up close, it was fractured, marred by the betrayal that had poisoned everything we had built together. In one photo, a candid shot of us on a beach, the waves lapping at our feet, Ethan's face appeared in the reflection of Kate's sunglasses. In another, quiet moment in our kitchen, the shadows on the wall twisted into shapes that resembled his hands. Each image was a piece of the puzzle, a reminder of what had been done, what had been lost. And then, at the very end of the gallery, was the final photograph. This one was different. It wasn't a moment from our life together. It was a portrait of Kate. A close-up of her face, her expression neutral, but her eyes told the story of everything she had kept hidden. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of Ethan's figure, standing in the distance like a specter from another life. She stood in front of it for what felt like an eternity. Her back was to me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She knew now. She understood what I had done. Finally, she turned, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. There was no anger in her gaze, no defensiveness. Just sadness. An overwhelming, crushing sadness. I walked toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. The guests around us continued to chat, oblivious to the storm brewing between us, the weight of the moment suffocating us both. When I reached her, we stood in silence for a long time, the air between us thick with everything that had been left unsaid. "You knew," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the gallery. I nodded. I knew. She looked back at the final photograph, her brow furrowing as she tried to process it all. "Why this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did it this way?" I exhaled slowly, trying to find the right words. "Because I wanted you to see. I wanted you to understand what it felt like. To see the truth hidden in plain sight. To feel the cracks that you tried to ignore." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She was struggling to breathe, the weight of her guilt and my pain pressing down on her. "I didn't do this to hurt you," I continued, my voice softer now. "I did it because I didn't know how else to make you understand. You asked me to forgive, to move on, but you never saw what I was carrying. You never saw how deep it went." She stared at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Mark, I'm so sorry." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I know, but sorry doesn't make it go away." She reached for my hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against mine. "Please, we can still fix this. We can still try." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could put the pieces back together, that somehow, we could find a way through the rubble of our shattered life. But standing there, in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by the evidence of everything we had lost, I wasn't sure if I could. I looked at her, at the woman I had loved for so long, and felt the weight of all the years pressing down on me. Maybe, I said quietly. But not like this. Her hand fell away, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes, the fear that maybe this was the end. Maybe we had already lost everything, and this was just the final act. We stood there in silence, the world continuing to move around us, the echoes of our past swirling in the air like ghosts. And in that moment, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't a decision I could make here, in this gallery, surrounded by reminders of what had been. It was something that would take time, something that would require both of us to face the truth, together. I took a step back, my heart heavy but resolute. I need time, Kate. I don't know what happens next, but I need time to figure it out. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, understanding. Okay, she whispered. Take all the time you need. And with that, I turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving the photographs, the memories, and the shattered pieces of our life behind me. For now, at least, I needed to breathe on my own, away from the weight of everything we had been. Only then could I decide if I was ready to rebuild, or if it was time to let it all go.